Welcome everyone to our Human Rights Monologues event. Before we begin, we wish to acknowledge that the land on which we present from today is Treaty 6 territory and a traditional meeting ground for the home for many, including Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, and other Indigenous peoples.
Let us welcome the President of LINGAP-Canada, To Sui Hin, Laureate UNESCO Prize for Peace Education 2000, to give the opening reflections for this 2021 celebration of Human Rights Day.
Shalom, Assalamualaikum, Namaste, Amitofo, Tanse. On behalf of LINGAP-Canada, may I extend our warmest and peaceful welcome to everyone to our celebration of Human Rights Day. Human Rights Day is observed every year on December 10th. In 1948, this is the day the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is indeed a milestone document. It proclaims the inalienable rights that everyone is entitled to as a human being, regardless of one's race, color, ethnicity, religion or faith, sex and other gender identities, language, social background, political and other opinion, nationality, or other status. This year's Human Rights Day focuses on the theme of equality in Article 1 of the Universal Declaration, namely that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. The principles of equality and non-discrimination are at the heart of human rights. We have to overcome all forms of discrimination, especially against the most vulnerable people in all societies, including women and girls, indigenous peoples, visible minorities, LGBTQ+ people, migrants, and people with disabilities, among others. LINGAP-Canada's vision is to help build a peaceful, non-violent, just, inclusive, and sustainable Canada, Philippines, and the world. This vision cannot be fulfilled unless all human rights of all peoples are upheld and defended. Hence, it is most relevant for LINGAP-Canada to join the global community in celebrating Human Rights Day. This celebration is co-sponsored by COPA, the Congress of the Philippine Associations of Alberta, Changing Together, Filipino-Canadian Saranay Association, Migrante Alberta, and Artist House Studio, and this University of Philippines Alumni Association of Edmonton. For 2021, LINGAP-Canada is celebrating Human Rights Day by presenting a virtual play entitled The Human Rights Monologues. The play will feature individuals or groups of Filipino-Canadians, other interested Canadians and Filipinos in the Philippines who will read monologues. The monologues will tell stories and experiences of human rights violations experienced by various peoples, as well as the appeals or statements of people who are acting in solidarity to defend and protect those human rights. Specific groups of peoples included in this Human Rights Monologues play are migrant workers, indigenous peoples, refugees, women and other gender identities, people suffering from gender-based violence, older persons, persons with disabilities, farmers and fisherfolk, street children, and victims of racism. These monologues are based on and inspired by stories shared by various peoples in Canada and the Philippines, as well as globally. Each monologue does not claim to represent an actual individual. The actors who volunteered to perform the monologues are members or friends of LINGAP-Canada and other NGOs and associations. Let us now listen to and be moved by the Human Rights Monologues, and to show our solidarity for the efforts of millions of people globally to overcome human rights violations and to protect and defend all human rights. Thank you. Maraming salamat po.
Before we commence the Human Rights Monologues, Let us listen to the song Batingao, performed by Migrant Thailand, a group of OFWs, overseas Filipino workers. Batingao was originally composed by Asin, the Filipino people band well known for their songs for peace, social justice, human rights, and environmental care. The lyrics of Batingao call on everyone to defend human rights, which is the core theme of Human Rights Day. The chorus says, human rights should be respected not only in spirit, but in heart as well. It is the foundation of justice, peace, and freedom. And now, here is Batingao, performed by Migrant Thailand, a group of OFWs, overseas Filipino workers.
Batingaw, ayaw na't ipaalam, sa mundo ay isigaw, karapatang pantao ay galang. Anumang dahilan, antas kulay o isipan, tao'y pahalagahan, karapatang likas panindigan. Karapatang pantao ay igalang, di lamang sa diwa, kundi sa puso man. Siyang sandigan ng katarungan, kapayapaan at kalayaan. Bayan na pinagpala, bayan na may kalinga, kinabukasan, alay sa mga bata. Tawag ng Batingaw, hayo na ipaalam, sa mundo ay isigaw, karapatang pantao ipaglaban. Pantao ay igalang, di lamang sa diwa, kundi sa puso man. Siyang sandigan ng katarungan, kapayapaan at kalayaan. Ang karapatang pantao ay igalang, di lamang sa diwa, sa puso man. Siyang sandigan ng katarungan, kapayapaan at kalayaan. Tayo ay lilikha, bayan na pinagpala, bayan na may kalinga, kinabukasan, alay sa mga bata.
Our human rights monologues begin with the rights of Indigenous peoples.
It is dawn as I stand looking over the Cordillera Mountains in northern Philippines. I was revisiting my ancestral home in Mountain Province, seeking some refuge from the ever-busy and rushed Metro Manila city. Breathing in the fresh, cool air and listening to the beautiful songs of the birds and chorus of the insects, I remembered vividly the teachings of my elders. They told me the mountains, rivers, skies, our land, our living, the home also of our ancestral spirits, and Kabunyan, our God. We must learn to live in harmony with our sacred environment so that it nourishes us as much as we sustain the earth for the well-being of our tribe, our children, our great-grandchildren, and all the generations to come. I understand now that these are not just beliefs of indigenous peoples. They are our cultural rights, the right to respect and maintain our culture. But when the Spanish colonizers came, and later the Americans, many things happened that undermined those rights. Postmodern education and the coming of the Western religion led some indigenous peoples to depreciate their traditional beliefs and spiritual practices. But I am glad that not all indigenous knowledge, skills, spirituality, and practices have been lost. The Cordillera indigenous peoples still have strong attachment to their sacred lands, and the elders continue to practice their rights to maintain their indigenous wisdom and knowledge. However, the human rights of indigenous peoples in the Philippines also include political, economic, and social rights, national development policies, and nowadays the forces of globalization have led to unjust displacements of some indigenous peoples from their ancestral domains. I remember the courageous nonviolent stories of indigenous struggles against the building of the Chico River Dam during the rule of President Marcos. The dam would have submerged the lands and homes of the Cordillera people. Indigenous women played major roles in the protest to stop the building of the dam. During the protest, indigenous leader Maclean Dulag was assassinated. He is commemorated now as one of our Cordillera heroes. I likewise reminisce the Itnags and Tingians of Abra who defended their pine forests from being logged by the Silophil Resources Corporation of Herminio de Sini. The Cordillera peoples remain steadfast until today in defending the land bequeathed by our ancestors. To us, land is sacred and land is life.
Anna Wilson.
Human rights. I first learned about human rights in school. The teacher said everyone has human rights because we are human beings. Each person's human rights have to be protected. This was proclaimed by the United Nations in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. In Canada, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and our laws also say that human rights of all Canadians must not be violated. But when I look back on the history of First Nations and all other Indigenous people in Canada, how can we say that human rights of Indigenous people have been protected and defended? In May this year, I, together with family members and Indigenous friends and also many non-Indigenous Canadians, heard the horrible news. Graves have been found near one of the residential schools in Kamloops, BC. I was deeply heartbroken. I cried and cried. I will never forget the stories I read. Survivors of hundreds of residential schools across Canada shared their horrific experiences to the National Truth and Reconciliation Commission that investigated from 2008 to 2015. Stories of how Indigenous children were forced to go to residential schools or else their fathers would go to jail. stories of violent, humiliating, and brutal physical and sexual emotional abuse at the hands of teachers and administrators, including even priests and nuns and other students, stories of long hours of forced labor in chores for the school, stories about how the schools wanted to assimilate Indigenous peoples into white man's culture. Indigenous peoples are savages. The children read in their history books, don't speak your languages. You must only speak English or French. And the children were punished by beatings and psychological abuse for not speaking the colonizers' language. Stories of how children had to repeatedly recite Christian prayers, stories of forced labor in chores for the school. It was cultural genocide. Before being forced into these residential schools, the children grew up in their Indigenous way of life. They learned how to hunt and gather food. They respected the elders and traditional knowledge and wisdom. All these traditional learnings were lost. Canada officially claims to be a champion of human rights internationally, but how Canada treated Indigenous peoples from the days of colonialism to the present day shows that Canada still has a lot to accomplish in respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples. The United Nations adopted the International Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People in 2007, but it took another 9 years before Canada ratified it, and only in 2021 that Bill C-15 was passed to implement this international declaration. I had the opportunity to go to a public school, but this right to education was not a happy or peaceful experience. I still remember the bullying by non-Indigenous students. I and other Indigenous students had to remain strong against this bullying and abuse. But unlike education under colonialism, the curriculum sought to ensure that all Alberta students are knowledgeable and understanding and respectful of the rich diversity of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit cultures. The education system should honor Indigenous history, cultures, languages, and perspectives. As an educator, I am glad to see this is a step forward in acknowledging the rights of Indigenous peoples to their culture and their social survival. We now hear more Canadians claiming implement human rights for Indigenous peoples, urgent action on the National Commission on Truth and Reconciliation report. However, there remains many challenges to be overcome. The treaties which were made between the Crown and Indigenous peoples have not yet been honored. They remain broken promises. As the Assembly of First Nation revealed, First Nations rights and titles to their lands have not been fully recognized or respected. Canada's national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls also reminds Canadians that violence against Indigenous women must end. Today is Human Rights Day. On this day, I hope all Canadians will be moved by the stories of suffering of the residential school children, the trauma still experienced by survivors of those schools, the continuing violations of the rights of Indigenous people, and act in solidarity to defend those rights. I
am a member of an NGO which was formed to raise awareness of the problems faced by Indigenous peoples globally. We also have many projects to act in solidarity with Indigenous peoples who are struggling to defend their human rights. There are about 370 million Indigenous people around the world, especially in Asia, Latin America, North America, and Africa. The stories you have just heard from Indigenous peoples in Canada and the Philippines are also common to the experience of other Indigenous peoples in other countries. It has been 14 years since the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, was adopted. This declaration set minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of the Indigenous peoples of the world. It seeks to protect the land rights and other economic, social, and cultural rights of Indigenous peoples. However, despite this declaration, which many countries have ratified, including the Philippines and most recently Canada, the violations of Indigenous peoples' rights have continued. They still experience cultural discrimination. Their Indigenous beliefs, knowledge, and spirituality traditions are not respected. Schooling often results in their assimilation to the majority culture, although some countries have begun to integrate Indigenous histories and knowledge into the curriculum. But the major problems caused by globalization and economic development have continued. Mega dams have displaced Indigenous peoples from their ancestral domains. The lands of Indigenous peoples are very rich in natural resources such as oil, gas, timber, and minerals. Logging of forests, cattle ranching, and modern agribusiness activities have undermined Indigenous ways of life. Mining is also another major economic development activity that has resulted in human rights violations of Indigenous peoples globally. In the Amazon region and in other countries, extraction of oil and gas and minerals have also caused pollutions and violations of Indigenous land rights. Often, force has been used to suppress Indigenous protests against such violations. An Indigenous leader has said mining is an outright violation of our inherent rights over our land and resources. Because our life depends on the land, our spirituality, our culture is basically in oneness with the land. Canada is home to about half of the world's mining companies active in many countries, including the Philippines. I hope concerned citizens will join the appeal of Indigenous peoples and solidarity, NGOs to call on Canada and other countries to regulate their mining corporations to exercise social, human rights, and environmental responsibility in their operations around the world. May I end the inspirational words of Gam Shimray, Secretary General of the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, in celebrating International Human Rights Day. For this, we call on our lands that we stand on, our ancestors to grace us with strength, love, and blessings, to take our struggle forward. Long live our struggle. Long live our solidarity. Let us now move by the monologues on the rights of street children.
Do you have time to listen to my story? Or do you even care? Please give me a couple of minutes. That would mean a lot to me. My name is Nora. I am 12 years old. I have lived on the streets for 5 years now. I stay near the mall in Barangay Pag-asa. My life is hard, very hard. Have I cried? Yes, many times, silently and when I am by myself. I left my home because my family cannot feed all my 6 sisters and brothers. My father has little work. He sells cigarettes and candy every day. My mother, she makes and sells banana cues. But when she is sick, she just lies in bed. I used to go to school for a few years. Then, when there is no money left for my books and uniforms and snacks, I stopped schooling. My father is also always angry at all of us children. When he drinks too much, he beats us. So I left my home. I have not seen my family for a long time already. I miss my mother and sisters and brothers. I joined other children like me. We stay together and help one another. That is how we survive. At night, we find places to sleep on cardboard under the overhead bridge. When it rains and the streets get flooded, we get very wet. There is no place to sleep. Many of us get sick during the rainy season. During summer, we work under the hot sun for many hours. And many of us also get sick. Yet many of us have survived. We sell sampaguita flowers or wash jeepneys to get a few pesos. We also try to find plastics and other scraps we can sell to shops, like these. When we are hungry, we search for leftover food in the garbage bins. The bins behind restaurants and markets are the best places to find food. We also try to beg from passerbys. Palimos po, ate pahinging barya. Sometimes they help a bit. Sometimes they tell us to go away. When we have more pesos, my friends and I buy cement glue to sniff. It gives us a happy feeling. We forget about our worries and sadness. I am very afraid of bad people who are going after street children, boys or girls, to become prostitutes. Oh, one of my friends, Angelito, was taken away. I don't know where he is now, but I hope he is okay. The barangay officials also chase after us. They say we are dirty and a nuisance. If they catch us, they will take us to detention centers. I heard life there is also not good. Here's one good thing about us. We go to church on Sundays to pray. We pray for a better life. We pray we can go to school and play and eat enough food like other Filipino children. So, is anyone listening to us? Do you hear me?
Greetings. I am Jocelyn, a staff member of Child Hope Foundation in Manila. We started this NGO in 1995 to support street children and protect their human rights to shelter, food, healthcare, education, other basic needs, and a safe environment to grow up with love and compassion. Officially, it is estimated that there are 250 street children in the Philippines. Other estimates say the number could be as high as 1 million. Many street children are homeless, and so they look for whatever shelter they can find besides streets, under bridges, parks, waiting sheds, push carts, and anything with roof. But some still go back to their families to sleep. All street children live and try to survive on the streets. They are school dropouts at an early age, as their poor families cannot afford to keep them in school. Domestic violence and broken families also push street children to leave their homes. They work long hours selling small items such as flowers, newspapers, candies, and cigarettes. Others get a few pesos washing vehicles or guarding parking spaces. Many scavenge for food and other items they can sell to recycling shops. Addiction to glue is a serious problem. Street children suffer from malnourishment and poor physical and mental health. They are also exposed to criminal gangs who recruit or force them into prostitution or to serve as drug couriers. They can also be harassed by local city officials and arrested by the police. Detained and in overcrowded cells with adults, they often suffer sexual exploitation and physical abuse. My NGO has staff and volunteer workers who approach street children, talk to them, and encourage them to move from their street life to our shelter. In the shelter, they are provided basic food, clothing, health, and sanitation. Our literacy programs help them catch up on their lost years of schooling and grow up in a safe and caring environment. Our counselors trained in trauma healing work gently with them to gain their trust and regain social skills based on respect for human rights and care for one another. We also provide training in vocational skills, which equip them for basic livelihoods. Our training programs also include the parents of the street children so they can earn enough income to feed their families and overcome the pressures of their children to survive on the streets. Our NGO also provides legal assistance to rescue street children arrested without due process and subjected to human rights violations. Many countries, including the Philippines and Canada, have ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. But for street children, these rights have not been protected. Unless the economic systems of global South countries are changed to ensure that all citizens have access to decent jobs, fair wages, adequate shelter, and health care, the human rights of street children like Nora, Angelito, and countless others will continue to be violated. Our NGO is one among many such organizations whose work depends on dedicated staff and volunteers. Canadian aid to the Philippines should prioritize and support NGOs that defend the rights of street children and encourage the Philippine government and powerful sectors such as business to build economies based on social and economic justice and human rights. We urge you all, listen to the stories of Noras and Angelitos in the Philippines. We next turn to the monologues on the rights of the rural poor and urban poor.
I am Manuel. I am a farmer in the town of Pilar, province of Capiz, in Western Visayas. I grew up on the farm that my parents and grandparents also worked on as farmers. I grow rice. Did you know that Western Visayas is the second largest rice producing region in the Philippines? Second to Central Luzon. The farmland we till to grow rice does not belong to us. We are tenant farmers. The landlord advances the cost of seeds, fertilizer, and equipment we use for farming. After harvest time, the landlord gets 70% of our harvest. We, the farmers, get 30%. Life has never been easy for us. During the dry season, the climate is hot and humid. During these times, we are thankful for a good harvest, but then we could run out of water supply. Thank God, our farming community has a good irrigation system. During the rainy season, continuous intense rain damages the crops. Sometimes this delays planting and harvesting. When a typhoon lashes through the town or province, the whole farmland becomes a sea of floating rice stalks. So you see, whether dry or rainy season, our livelihood as farmers is at the mercy of the elements. Why are we still tenant farmers? Why don't we own the land we till? My parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents, they have been working on this land like forever. We are still waiting for agrarian reform. After so many years since the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program was started by President Cory Aquino, many tenant farmers are still not given their right to own the land that they farm. The program is too slow. The Poor Farmers Associations and NGOs say that the CARP laws have loopholes. The loopholes allow landlords and big landowners to continue to avoid land redistribution. Some landowners even have armed guards to prevent land redistribution. So we farmers are at the mercy of the weather and the landlords. And yet another challenge is facing us. The government has allowed extensive importation of huge quantities of cheap rice from Vietnam and Thailand. This has caused the price of our local rice products to go down. Our rice production costs have gone up, but market prices for our rice has gone down. This has forced many rice farmers into debt bondage. We are trapped in an ever deeper cycle of poverty. We farmers are feeding our people, and yet we are dying of hunger ourselves. I do not want to see my children follow in my footsteps. I do not want them to suffer the same fate I am suffering now. Something must be done.
I am Amado Cruz from Infanta, Pangasinan province. I have been a fisherman for all my life. My father was a fisherman too, and so was my grandfather. Most of the time, it's a very hard life. When the weather is fine, no typhoons, no big waves, we go out on a 3-day fishing trips. Our bodies are baked under the hot sun, in the middle of the sea. If we are lucky, we bring back a boatload of fish and the traders buy them all. They then sell in the markets in the bigger towns, getting many times more than they paid us. During the stormy season, we don't dare sail out. The sea can be treacherous. Many of our friends have been swallowed by big waves. Those who could come back have horrifying tales to share. So we try to find other work like construction or other odd jobs. Sometimes we spend time repairing our boats and nets. While life was hard then, I've been able to earn enough. I could feed my family and send my 4 children to school. The best fishing is in the lagoon and seas around the coral reefs of Panatag Shoal or Scarborough Shoal. We can catch fish that sell at higher prices. Lapu-lapu, maya-maya, and tangige. That was 5 years ago. But now there are many big Chinese fishing boats, trawlers. They've come to fish in the Philippine waters. Chinese Coast Guard ships are also there to stop us from entering the lagoon. They use loud horns and water cannons to warn us away. Once, I heard that a Chinese Coast Guard asked a Filipino boat to hand over some fish already caught. So now, we Filipino fishermen are bringing shore less and less fish. We now catch barely 50% of what we used to catch. My income from fishing is now not enough to feed my family. Do you think this is fair? Our government leaders, senators, politicians say that the Scarborough Shoal is in the West Philippine Sea. It is in our economic zone, and the fish in the zone belongs to the Philippines. So why do trawlers of another country control and overfish the seas where we used to fish freely to feed our families? How can poor fisherfolk families like myself and my fellow fishermen survive? The Philippines is a country surrounded by so much seas and oceans full of fish. Yet, Filipino fisherfolk are among the poorest Filipinos. I belong to an association of Filipino fisherfolk. We are joining hands with many other fisherfolk movements around the country. The fisherfolk movements are speaking out. It is our human right to catch fish to feed our families and communities. We are calling on the government to protect us, our seas from foreign trawlers. We are very concerned that their overfishing will result in the death of our country's fisheries. When that happens, all Filipinos, not just fisherfolk, will suffer. Before it is too late, we, the fisherfolk, appeal to all Filipinos and concerned people around the world to support our campaign. Raise your voices together with us, fisherfolks in the Philippines.
I'm part of the staff of a non-government organization, or NGO for short. My NGO works to defend the rights of the rural poor in the Philippines, mainly the fisherfolk and farmers. We want our Filipino fisherfolk and small farmers to live with dignity. We want them to be recognized for their vital contribution to our country's food security and well-being. But there are so many challenges and obstacles to overcome. Over 30 years, successive governments have promoted rural development policies. These policies claim to improve the livelihoods of our fisherfolk and farmers. For example, provision of credit, modern agricultural technologies, infrastructures, and training. After the EDSA People Power Revolution, a major rural development policy was CARP, or the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program. The goal was to distribute land to landless farmers and laborers. The land is to be appropriated with compensation to the landlords who own large areas of agricultural land. Alas, this agrarian reform program is hindered with many problems. Beneficiaries to small plots of land have not received sufficient supports to farm their crops, such as credit for inputs like seeds and fertilizers, irrigation, post-harvest facilities, and marketing. There are also loopholes in the agrarian reform program. Exemptions have been granted for land conversion, such as housing estates. Distributed land can still be under the control of landowners due to corruption and violent resistance. The voluntary land transfer scheme has been corrupted, allowing land to be distributed to dummies of fictitious beneficiaries. Farmers campaigning for their land rights have suffered political repression. Some of their leaders have been assassinated. Many have been red tagged, accused of being members or supporters of the CCP-NPA insurgency. The story of rice farming in the Philippines is tragic. Today, the country no longer grows enough rice to feed their own people. The importation of cheaper rice from other countries has gravely affected the livelihood of Filipino rice farmers. You've heard Amado's lament. The recent rice tariffication law in 2019 allows overseas rice imports to enter the local market without restrictions and without the licensing power of the National Food Authority. The cheaper imported rice has dealt a serious blow to local rice farmers who could no longer afford to grow rice. The COVID-19 lockdowns have also prevented farmers from selling their produce to urban markets. We have witnessed tragic scenes of farmers dumping tons of unsold vegetables. Farmers say government cash aid and food rations during the pandemic is barely enough to feed their own families. Agriculture is the most vital contributor to basic economic development of the Philippines. Millions of Filipinos toil on farms to produce food for fellow Filipinos. Clearly, the rights of our farmers and agricultural workers must be protected. Climate change ushering extreme and unpredictable weather conditions has brought more suffering to our Filipino farmers, as well as our fisherfolk. As Manuel's story also tells us, the rights of our Filipino fisherfolk have been seriously violated by foreign fishing fleets, especially from China. Many fisherfolk also cannot go out very far to fish, as they have small boats. They are catching fewer fish because they lack appropriate technology, and also due to the pollution of coastal areas from agricultural chemicals and industrial household wastes. Destructive fishing techniques like dynamite fishing has also killed coral reefs where fish breed. I'm sure you agree with me that the fishing industry must receive priority support from government agencies to address these problems. Our NGO, other NGOs, and associations representing the fisherfolk and concerned civic, religious, and political leaders are calling for urgent government action to defend the sovereignty of our country's marine territory. In a peaceful, just, and sustainable society, there should be no rural poor or urban poor. There should be only Filipinos who live and work in peace, dignity, justice, and democracy in our natural, rich-resourced rural and urban spaces. We urge the Philippine government, join the global movement and enact measures for climate action and climate justice. Create robust agricultural development policies that promote social justice. Sustainable farming must be implemented. As an NGO advocating for farmers and fisherfolk's rights, we continue to demand genuine land reform.
Our first intermission song reminds us that all peoples are entitled to civil and political rights, such as the right to life and freedom from torture, inhumane punishment, extrajudicial executions, and slavery, to freedom from arbitrary arrest and detention, and the right to habeas corpus, to due process, justice, and a fair trial, to freedoms of movement, thought, conscience, and religion, speech, association, and assembly, family rights, and the right to privacy, to political participation, including the right to vote, to prohibition of any propaganda for war and hatred, to right to a name and nationality, to non-discrimination, minority rights, and equality before the law.
These rights are spelled out in the 1966 International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Canada ratified the covenant in 1976. The Philippines ratified it in 1986. The peoples of Canada and the Philippines are entitled to the fulfillment of all these civil and political rights. However, the histories of Canada and the Philippines and modern political and social events have shown that while successive governments have made progress on promoting these rights, violations of civil and political rights are still happening. A good sign, though, is that many citizens and groups are continuing to defend these rights. Some of them are reflected in the monologues presented in this human rights play. Our first intermission is a musical presentation entitled Guantanamera, a very popular song not only in Cuba but around the world. The lyrics of Guantanamera are drawn from poems written by the Cuban revolutionary hero Jose Marti. Marti, born 1853, died 1895, was a poet, writer, philosopher, and leader of the movement for Cuban independence from Spanish colonialism. He spent several years in exile in Europe, USA, and Venezuela. His poetry writings and political vision embrace the principles of freedom, liberty, justice, and love, which are core values in promoting civil and political rights. For the Filipino people, our nationalist hero and martyr, Jose Rizal, born June 19, 1861, died December 30, 1896, a doctor, writer, linguist, similarly challenged Spanish colonial rule and worked for a free and independent Philippines through his writings and political organizing. The lyrics of Guantanamera say, "I'm an honest man, from where the palm trees grow, and before I die, I want to let my verses out of my soul. My verse is clear green and burning red. My verse is a wounded deer that seeks refuge in the mountain, and for the cruel one that tears away from me, the heart with which I live, I cultivate neither thistles nor nettles. I cultivate the white rose." Let us now listen to the music rendition of Guantanamera played by Erica Cawagas and Jaya Cawagas Cates from Artist House Studio.
We now share the monologues on the right to be free from racism and cultural discrimination.
My name is Stella. I became conscious of my race or ethnic background when I was only 6 years old. I was in a daycare and one of the boys began teasing me. And when the caretaker asked why, he jeered, "Her skin looks like poop. Ugly, ugly." All I heard was how I was ugly, how I was different from Canadians like him, and being different was bad. While the caretaker reprimanded him and probably said something about how it wasn't true, as a confused 6-year-old, I accepted the boy's declaration as truth. I felt ugly in a classroom and school of mostly white children with fair skin and apple-colored cheeks. Who was I? This child with dirt brown skin and tough to manage black hair. Somehow, I was not only different, but I was also made to feel as less equal and less deserving of respect. After school, I often cried at home from those bullying. I grew up surrounded primarily by people of lighter skin tones, and I desperately wanted to be the same. I wanted to fit in. I wanted to be like everyone else. I wanted to look like the children on television. I also saw commercials for creams with tagline, "Love the skin you're in." I hated the tagline. Loving your skin is not always easy. How can you love your skin when the world tells you it's not the right skin? It's really hard to love the skin you're in when the world tells you you're not beautiful in it. Books, magazines, movies, and TV, they all celebrate white-skinned celebrities who want to be tanned and dark-skinned celebrities who want to be light. Regular and online stores market all kinds of skin whitening creams and soaps. I recall the slogan of Black Americans and Canadians, "Black is beautiful." But shouldn't skin of all colors, whether brown, yellow, red, or white, be beautiful? I knew more and more and felt deep in my heart no one should be discriminated because of their skin color. Now I have a university degree and a professional job. I have also come to realize that racism is not just being seen as ugly or different. In school, I remembered how Canadian history paid less attention to Indigenous and non-European history, culture, and knowledge. I also have friends from so-called visible minority groups who have experienced discrimination. For example, in trying to rent accommodations. My ethnic background is not from the ethnicity or culture established to be powerful by history and supporting systems and structures. I find that I have to work harder, demonstrate greater achievement, prove myself more in order to receive recognition. The Black Lives Matter movement has challenged systemic racism and discrimination. I find that inspiring. I have joined many Black Lives Matter rallies and marches in solidarity with Black and African Canadians. But not all types of racism have caught as much attention. It is time to end all forms of racism and discrimination.
I am Nilda. I'm a volunteer in an NGO that was created to promote anti-racist education. We are here to help raise the understanding of people of our country's rich cultural diversity and empower them to overcome the problems of racism and cultural discrimination. We are proud that worldwide, Canada has been recognized for a policy of multiculturalism. Yes, some programs in schools, institutions, and organizations in public and private sectors have contributed to the promotion of the rights of people to access, participate in, and enjoy culture, cultural heritage, and cultural expressions. This means that all people from their early age should learn to understand and respect all cultures through dialogue, communication, and sharing of cultural ideas, knowledge, values, beliefs, and practices. But our intercultural and multicultural education has to go beyond knowing and appreciating the 4Ds. What are these 4Ds? In schools, we refer to them as diet, our food, dance, and other artistic expressions, dialect, our diverse languages, and dress, our clothing traditions. How then can we authentically promote cultural rights beyond the 4Ds? We need to learn the deep roots of beliefs, customs, and wisdom in all cultures. When we do, we learn not only about the differences among cultures, we also realize that there are many common values and principles to unite people as a common humanity. Again and again, our NGO work shows that understanding and respecting our cultural diversity is not enough. We hear so many stories about victims of racism and cultural discrimination. Parents from Indigenous, Black, African, Asian, Hispanic, and other non-Caucasian cultures tell us about the racist and ethnic bullying of their children in schools. Workers in factories, offices, and business establishments often suffer from racism and discrimination because their ethnic and cultural background is not Canadian. The brutal legacies of racist colonization continue to impact on the human rights of our First Nations and Indigenous peoples. Just recently, we saw the discovery of hundreds of graves of children at the sites of residential schools. Modern economic development and globalization continue to undermine the rights of Indigenous peoples for cultural survival and self-determination. The Black Lives Matter movement has mobilized tremendous social energies to challenge and overcome systemic racism and discrimination. After 9/11, Islamophobia has targeted Muslims or anyone identified as coming from Islamic backgrounds. The rights of Muslim people to practice their faith or religion has been violated. Oftentimes, they have suffered harassment, stereotyping, and even physical attacks. Our NGO supports interfaith dialogue, where peoples of diverse faiths and spirituality traditions learn to understand and respect each other's beliefs, recognize their shared values, and take common action to build a world based on peace, nonviolence, justice, diversity, human rights, and sustainable futures. Since the COVID-19 pandemic, we have also seen the rise of racist attacks against people identified as Asians. These Asians have been verbally abused, threatened, and even assaulted. The attackers have stereotyped Asians as spreading COVID-19 from Asia to Canada and other regions of the world. government agencies, educational and social institutions, and NGOs, including my own, have challenged such racist stereotyping. My dear friends, racism and cultural discrimination are not easily overcome, but together with numerous other NGOs and agencies, we hope that our center's educational programs will gradually help people to understand the roots of racism, be empowered to act in solidarity to end racism, and to defend cultural rights of all peoples.
Canada has been receiving thousands of overseas workers, including many from the Philippines. Here are the monologues on the rights of overseas workers.
Joyce is from the Philippines. She studied to be a teacher and finished her Bachelor of Science in Secondary Education. But she spent 3 years in Hong Kong as a domestic worker before she came to Canada under the Canada's Caregiver Program. The agency charged her an application fee of over $5,000. At first, she was happy with her employers. The working conditions were pleasant and reasonable. Joyce took care of 3 children and helped in light housekeeping and cooking.
When I was sick, the family would not give me leave to recover. They would not take me to see the doctor because I have no medical insurance. But I told them that is not true. The caregiver contract gives me sick leave and medical coverage. One day, I suddenly found myself fired for medical reason. That was quite a blow. I was so sad and disappointed. After spending so much to come to Canada, I always thought Canadians are fair and Canada is a democratic country that respects the rights of workers. After a few jobless days, I got very worried. How can I meet the 2-year period of employment so I can apply for my PR or permanent residency and be reunited later with my husband and 2 children back in the Philippines? The recruitment agency has also completely abandoned me.
To continue staying in the caregiver program, Joyce had to find a new employer, willing to pay and wait for a labor market impact assessment, LMIA, so she could get a new work permit. But after 6 months, the prospective employer could not wait anymore. She had to find another new employer. She also asked her previous employers to compensate for her unpaid wages. They refused. Now, Joyce is trying to sue them so she can get paid for what they legally owe her. It has been a great stress for Joyce after all the sacrifices she made to be a caregiver to help a Canadian family raise their children with love and care. She was never remiss in her duty and care for the children entrusted to her. She treated them like her own children. I am sure her story is not unique. As I follow up my case, I hear similar stories told here and there, openly in whispers for fear of reprisals. I am also sure that many Canadians have a strong sense of justice who can easily see when a fellow human being is mistreated. My earnest prayer and hope is that the collective stories of caregivers will touch the hearts of the Canadian people to take action so that no one will have suffer like Joyce again.
My name is Conrado, but my family and friends call me Dado. I used to work as a technician in a province in a central Luzon in the Philippines. I spent over 6 years working in a computer chip factory in Taiwan. When I heard about the temporary foreign workers program in Canada from a friend, he told me that there are jobs in oil and gas industry in Alberta with good wages. So I decided to apply. I paid the recruitment agency over $3,000. They promised me that I could later apply for permanent resident. I have also heard that Canada is a good and safe country to live in. Unfortunately, after 2 years, the industry was hit by economic shutdown and my employer could not renew my contract. I was with a group of over 10 other Filipino workers. We had to urgently find another employer. This time, we paid $5,000 each to an agency to cover all the costs of a labor market impact assessment that the employer has to submit to get us a new work permit. But this did not happen. For the second time, we were again scammed by another immigration consultant. Finally, I moved to Ontario and began to find all kinds of work to survive. How can I return to the Philippines and face my family after so much effort to come here hoping to succeed? I have become an undocumented foreign worker living in the shadow of Canadian society. I have a live-in partner and we have 2 children who were both born in Canada. This life without status is so difficult, full of hardship and pressure. Imagine this, when I was sick with very high fever, the clinic said that I have to pay $500 since my Medicare card has expired. Since I could not be treated in a clinic, I have to resort to self-medication to keep myself healthy so I can work for daily to feed my family. When I was working as a temporary foreign worker with the permit, I also paid taxes and worked hard to contribute to Canadian economy. I am also working in a low-paid job as a frontline worker during the COVID pandemic. My work is essential to the welfare of Canadians, yet I cannot access healthcare. This is not fair. This is certainly not humane. But I cannot speak up openly. I fear I will be deported if my situation is revealed to authorities. I know there are many NGOs and other groups who know how much we are suffering. My voice and the voices of undocumented foreign workers do not have the same power as the voices of concerned Canadians. I hope and pray that you will be able to change the government policies on undocumented foreign workers and provide us an opportunity to gain legal status and to be treated with respect, equality, and dignity.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Cynthia Palmaria, and I'm one of the co-founder of Migrant, Alberta, a not-for-profit community organization since 2013 that advocates for the rights and welfare of precarious workers such as migrants and the undocumented. I have pledged to become an advocate of migrants after having witnessed the situation of my parents who came to Canada as caregivers under the foreign domestic movement in the 1980s. My parents have left the Philippines to provide a better future for me and my sister. We were separated for 8 years and finally became reunited as a family in Quebec. I have witnessed the abuse and unfair treatment that my parents experienced from their employers while they work as caregivers, and this has left me questioning Canadian immigration programs that put migrant workers in a precarious situation. Migrant Alberta's mandate is to educate, organize, and mobilize our members on issues that impact our community. We also work in solidarity with different organizations, local unions, and other ethnic groups to support the issues of workers. The stories that Conrado and Joyce shared are not isolated. They illustrate the daily reality of migrant workers who came to Canada under the Temporary Foreign Workers Program. They are workers in the service sector, food industry, healthcare, and caregivers who look after children, the elderly, and those with high medical needs. Under this program, they need to complete the immigration requirements to qualify for permanent residence. The temporary nature of their immigration status renders them precarious and makes it challenging for them to fight for their rights when experiencing abuse and violations. Consequences could include losing their job or even worse, losing their immigration status. The current pandemic has exacerbated their situation as delays in immigration processes have resulted to expired work permits. Some of them have already lost their status and have lost their access to services such as healthcare. So, Migrant Alberta has launched the Healthcare for All campaign to ensure access to healthcare for migrant workers and the undocumented. If they say that we're all in this together, everyone's health and safety depends on equal access to healthcare services. Migrant Alberta, along with our friends and allies, have also launched the regularization campaign, calling on the Canadian and provincial government to grant permanent status and equal rights to these workers, similar to any Canadian worker. In commemoration of International Human Rights Day, here and around the world, I urge you to support our organization and our campaigns because we believe that only through a unified approach can we move forward as a community. Along with Migrante International in the Philippines, we strive for a society where we do not have to leave our country and our families in order to survive. We'd like to thank LINGAP-Canada for inviting Migrante Alberta during this important event. And thank you all for listening to our stories.
Refugees have also made Canada their home. Let us listen next to the monologues of the rights of refugees.
My husband and my two children and I are refugees from Latin America. We fled for our country, Colombia, in the middle of the civil war. We were very scared. We saw so many people shot and the homes destroyed because of the violence fighting between the military, guerrillas, and paramilitary groups. There were thousands of the other people and families just like us. So we decided to leave our community and escape to Ecuador. The journey took us several days. We were always hungry and thirsty. We prayed we would not be caught of the middle the fighting. We finally arrived close to into Ecuador. For the moment, we feel safe, but life in the city was not easy. It's very difficult and is extremely hard to get work permits. We always are hungry and don't have care. Sadly, refugees were not welcome for the local people. I was very worried about the safety of my daughter. We know many women refugees from Colombia has been forced into prostitution. Thank you, God, our application to be a refugee in Canada was approved. We arrived in the middle of the winter. It was so cold. There was snow everywhere. My children feel like an it's into in the refrigerator. We received help and support from the refugees office to settle down, but we have to repay to immigration loan. Those include our transportation costs of coming to Canada. We stayed in an apartment building unit. It was very old building. We are thankful we have a place to stay. My son has a breathing problem. My heart is quite ached to see him struggle. Some neighbors are friendly, but others obviously don't like us. Most of the time, we keep to ourselves. We were given a health card. We so could get free medical service, but we cannot afford dental service and medicine is so expensive. Unfortunately, my husband could not find regular work for several months. His applications were rejected. He said, speak English is very difficult. In my community, we speak Spanish. I too wanted to work to help support my family, but it's very difficult to get childcare services. Maybe it is a discrimination. Other refugees we have met warned us. Canadian culture is very difficult, and not many Canadians know about our culture. When we visit the hospital, it is difficult to understand the doctors and nurses. I have not yet learned to speak English well. It is also embarrassing to be examined for a male doctor because in my culture, women prefer to be treated by female doctors. But I am happy now. I joined my English language class for refugees and immigrants. These classes are organized by Center for Immigrant and Refugee Women. I have also learned some computer skills, and I believe these new skills will help me find work. My children are also now going to school. Their English has improved, but they told me some of their classmates make fun of them. I hope the school and teachers will do something to stop this bullying. Before coming here, I read that Canada has a multiculturalism policy. Canada welcomes thousands of refugees every year, and our family is grateful we were accepted as refugees. Here, we can live a new life away from wars and fear. We pray every day that the difficulties we face will one day be overcome.
I work for a nonprofit Canadian center set up to support refugees who have arrived in Canada. In 1969, Canada signed the 1951 Refugee Convention, and so Canada has obligations under international law to protect the rights of refugees. When refugees arrive in Canada, they need a lot of support and assistance to help them get settled into life in Canadian society. Even before their journey to Canada, refugees have already endured great hardships, fleeing from wars, persecution, displacement, and all sorts of human rights violations. Is it true that many Canadians have warmly received refugees? Yet refugees still face many challenges in integrating into a very different cultural and social environment. Canadian Department of Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship is the official agency responsible for refugees. However, the multiple goals and objectives implementing policies for refugees also involve the key role of NGOs and nonprofit associations. Like many similar nonprofit associations and groups, our center has been providing various programs to assist refugees in overcoming many challenges. Our staff and volunteers can speak various languages. We provide information and support for refugees. We find suitable accommodation, access healthcare, trauma healing, and other social services. We offer training vocational skills, legal and financial tasks, and assist them in applying for jobs. We help them enroll their children in high school and schools. Our tutors also support children and youth in their schooling through after-school hours tutorial and emotional social support. Refugees face problems of isolation, and our center also connects them to community activities. Women refugees experience even more settlement challenge due to gender inequality. Our center also provides refugees with programs to empower them to assert their rights. Some refugees experience problems arising from poor quality accommodation. We have asked agencies to rearrange and fund policies that enable refugees to move into affordable, decent housing. Refugees often arrive with poor proficiency in English. This results in miscommunication when accessing healthcare and other social and legal services. Our center provides some basic English training, but government agencies should provide training opportunities in English as a second language. We also hear so many stories of refugees struggling to find employment, even when they have high-level education. My center support campaigns appealing to employers to hire refugees. There are stories of racism and other cultural discrimination that refugees have to live with these experiences in their daily life, in their neighborhood, school, workplaces. A positive note, not all Canadians are racist. Many have welcomed refugees and support them in integrating into Canadian society, but we cannot close our eyes to systemic racism. We cannot look the other way when the rights of refugees continue to be violated. There are existing anti-discrimination and anti-racist policies programs. The federal, provincial, and local governments have to implement them. Our center has included such anti-racist education in our activities. We are glad that schools and other educational institutions are integrating anti-racist awareness and strategies in their curriculum and practices. We also collaborate with the City Council to enhance their anti-racism and anti-discrimination programs that will benefit not only refugees, but also migrants and newcomers. Let me conclude by citing the Canadian Council for Refugees report in 2017. As a community, we need to ensure that our refugees receive a level of support that equips them to put down healthy roots so that they can flourish and contribute as so many are eager to do.
Our second intermission is a poem written by the Comboni missionaries of the Heart of Jesus in the Philippines. It calls on everyone to welcome strangers.
Don't call me a stranger. Don't call me a stranger. I need to feel at home, especially when loneliness cools my heart. Don't call me a stranger. The soil we step on is the same, but mine is not the promised land. Don't call me a stranger. The color of my passport is different, but the color of our blood is the same. Don't call me a stranger. The language I speak sounds different, but the feelings it expresses are the same. Don't call me a stranger. I toil and struggle in your land, and the sweat of our brows is the same. Don't call me a stranger. Borders, we created them, and the separation that results is the same. Don't call me a stranger. I am just your friend, but you do not know me yet. Don't call me a stranger. We cry for justice and peace in different ways, but our God is the same.
The following monologue tells the stories of the rights of persons based on their gender identities.
My name is Carol. I'm 27 years old. When I started my relationship with my ex-partner, I really felt he was a reliable and loving man, so we agreed to live in his apartment on the north side. The abuse didn't start right away. It started in little ways. I messed up on making him food the way he liked, so he threw it at me. My fault. I couldn't keep things clean enough to his liking. My fault. I was too loud and talked back too much. My fault. I can change. If I could just be perfect, then we could have our perfect love again. But as time went on, he went back to drinking and things only got worse. No matter what I did, I was never enough, and anything wrong was my fault. I can pick up on patterns and change my behavior accordingly, but pets can't. Don't you touch her, I told him about our cat. The first time I had stood up against him. The hissing cat was no longer his concern. He lifted me up by my throat and watched me squirm. I could see spots in my vision and no way to get out. He threw me down and raped me. Over the next 2 months, I endured his bouts of anger, not just verbal abuse, but also punching that left a black eye and bruised. I knew I needed to get out, but how? He would notice I was gone and come looking for me. Where would I stay? I haven't talked to my sister or friends in months. I don't know this end of town well. Would anyone believe me? If he found me, he'd kill me for sure this time. Where can I stay with my cat? How can I afford rent on my own? I've never lived alone. These are the thoughts that overwhelmed me. I don't know who to thank for what came next, the neighbor for reporting it, or the officers who came and saw the signs. They pulled me aside and asked if I needed help. I knew this might be my only chance to leave, so I let them take me to a shelter. But it was far from over. I could feel him looking for me, cursing my name. I blocked his number on my phone, but he called anyways, leaving threatening voicemails. I got an emergency protection order, but I did not feel protected. The shelter told me I had 21 days to find a place to go. Everything was closing in to crush me. In this moment, I decided I would be strong. I would not put up with this abuse ever again. I decided to press charges against him. I would not let him do what he did to me to someone else. I fought for myself. Thankfully, my stay was extended and I could stay at the shelter until I found a place where I could bring my cat. I got her back. We worked together to heal from what we had been through. I bought my own furniture and I was finally feeling proud of myself. When the court case came up, COVID-19 restrictions pushed things back over and over again, and I have still not been able to face him. I was told if he pleads guilty, he will receive a 2-year prison sentence. But I'm worried about what might happen after he is released. He will come looking for me. Should I move to another city?
Hello, my name is Anand. I was called gay before I knew what that meant. Kids would say, "That's so gay. Don't be gay. Gross, that sounds gay. What is gay? What did it mean to be gay?" Before I knew the meaning, I had already understood enough. It was bad to be gay. And if you were gay, that means you were bad. It means there is something wrong with you. Before I knew what gay meant, I had already been labeled as such. By the kids who wrote Gaylord on the sidewalk in front of my house. By the kids who followed me home and spat on me. By the kids who did not want to sit next to me for fear my gay was contagious. Through junior high, high school, to university, I was constantly bombarded with the implications of being gay. It was a sin, immoral, disgusting. Home or school, parent or classmate, I could hear them criticize the me who they had not met, hear them criticize someone they did not fully understand, nor intend to try and understand. I learned to confine the person who they seemed to hate and to listen to a different voice. The voice telling me to act one way, to dress one way, to be one way. Thinking every moment I was thinking, is this it? Is this enough? Am I doing it right? Will you love me? But can anyone love you when the you they love is not you? At a moment in my life, I began to measure time differently. In the scars, both physical and emotional. In the tears I cried. In the days I counted down until I could say goodbye. But the countdown stopped by gentle hands that held me back and kept me here. I was inspired. There is a growing community of LGBTQ+ people, together, voices united against hate. I know there are now many others who have come out. I revisited my university and saw that the rise of activism in students, both straight and not, who took to the streets to build pride corners, to face off against hate in the disguise of godliness. The Faculty of Education houses an Institute for Sexual Minority Studies and Services, educational programs and services to support the LGBTQ+ community and its allies. Times have changed and are continuing to change every day, but my friends and I know the challenges continue elsewhere. In many countries, like the Philippines, entrenched cultural, religious, and social views remain steadfast in the face of true change. My Filipino friends tell me bullying, harassment, discrimination, hate crimes, and even murders are an everyday norm. Not to mention the difficulties in gaining political participation. But there are changes, rays of hope for the LGBTQ+ youth in the Philippines. The Department of Education has an order to protect children from violence, abuse, and exploitation, regardless of sexual orientation and gender identity. Some campuses have held pride events, enabled the election of LGBTQ+ students to councils. Large cities like Manila, Quezon City, Cebu City, and Davao City have passed ordinances against LGBTQ+ discrimination. No matter the fight we win in our hometowns, we must keep fighting until every man, woman, or other, be they white or brown, is free to love.
Hello, I am Isabel, a university professor in gender studies. I'm also active in NGO and campaigns for rights based on gender identities and gender equality. The stories we have just heard from Anand and Carol are not unique. The pain and suffering from discrimination, violence, and other human rights violations based on gender identity and gender inequality are experienced all over the world. The data is shocking. For example, it is estimated that 1 in 3 women and girls experience physical or sexual violence in their lifetime, most frequently but not limited to an intimate partner. Such gender-based violence has actually increased during the COVID-19 pandemic. Indigenous women in Canada today are 7 times more likely than non-Indigenous women to be murdered and are also much more likely to experience sexual violence. Discrimination against persons who are a part of the LGBTQ+ community have also resulted in physical assaults, and in some countries, criminal punishment by their government. A bolder response of government agencies and NGOs to address gender-based violence is vital. Hence, shelters have been established to protect women from further violence, who will also need psychological, emotional, and legal support. Police officers and judges all need to enhance their gender sensitivity and strengthen their capacity to address gender-based violence. Did you know that 71% of all human trafficking victims worldwide are women and girls? And 3 out of 4 of these trafficked women are girls, and 3 out of 4 of these trafficked women and girls are sexually exploited. Forced marriage, child marriage, female genital mutilation, and are other forms of gender-based violence. UN agencies such as the UN Women and international NGOs like the Coalition Against Trafficking of Women have programs and campaigns to resolve the crisis of human trafficking. But the root cause that fuel trafficking have not been fully addressed. This requires political will of national governments to significantly reduce the gender gap. So you see, human rights violations based on gender identity cannot focus on gender-based violence alone. Gender inequality exists worldwide, especially in global South countries. Listen to this. Women work 2/3 of the world's working hours, produce half of the world's food, and yet earn only 10% of the world's income and own 1% of the world's property. In many countries, women and girls have far less access to education. They are underrepresented in economic and political decision-making. The reproductive and sexual rights of women are often lacking. Look, here is one good model, though, not so perfect yet. In the Philippines, the Responsible Parenthood and Reproductive Health Act of 2012, known as the RH Law, is a significant move forward towards gender equality for Filipino women. However, challenges and obstacles remain in its implementation. For example, limitations on sexual education for adolescents and effective coordination among multi-sectoral agencies. Bear with me as I have one final point. Gender-based human rights violations will require deep changes in cultural norms and attitudes. This means people in all cultures must be open to overcoming the powerful traditions of patriarchy around the world. When children are brought up to accept that men are superior and more powerful than women, then they will grow up to promote or maintain such gender inequalities.
As a professor in gender studies, I continually advocate for an education that promotes non-sexism, reject sexist stereotyping of roles in the family, media, and all social institutions. Let us highlight strong female role models in all walks of life, including political leadership.
May we now listen to the monologue reminding us of the rights of persons with disabilities.
Good evening. My name is Angelo. My story started when I was a teenager in the city of Antipolo. Antipolo is about 20 kilometers from Manila, the capital city of the Philippines. I am now in my early 50s, with a university degree and a family. Let's go back 40 years ago. One day, I was riding my bicycle when a car accidentally hit me. I was thrown off my bike and I hit the pavement. I suffered a serious injury in my spinal cord. After a few days in the hospital, the doctors told my parents my legs are paralyzed and I would not be able to walk again. That was the saddest moment in my life. To be told I would not be able to grow up normally. I would not be able to participate in sports and other physical activities. I would never be a regular student in school. What employment opportunities would be open to me? I learned to use a wheelchair. I am very grateful to my parents and all my family members. They supported me in my recovery. They helped me adapt to a challenging life. I continued to attend high school. Every day was always full of challenges. The school building was more than 30 years old. There was no access for students in wheelchairs. There were no ramps. And so my parents and teachers had to assist me to access the building. Luckily, my classroom was on the ground floor, but the library and other facilities were on the second floor. It was not easy to be carried up the stairs to reach those classrooms, but I am always thankful that my classmates and teachers were very understanding and helpful. The washrooms were difficult for me. They were too small. It was hard to maneuver my wheelchair. I came to learn the term PWD, meaning persons with disabilities. It applies to me. I have a physical disability like some other students have, but there were also other students with other kinds of disabilities. I came across those who lost their eyesight. Some are hard of hearing, and some have so-called learning disabilities. For these students, the school had a special education class. They were provided special assistance in their learning. There were a few teachers who used sign language to help the students. Blind students learned by using Braille. My parents told me that some other schools in the city were very short of teachers trained in special needs education. I was glad that in my school, there was little bullying of students with disabilities. Most people were kind and supportive. Students were always ready to assist in their small way. In Antipolo, some children with disabilities could not attend school. Those who are out of school could not find work. They live in isolation and intense feelings of insecurity. The Philippines now has several laws and regulations to protect the rights of PWDs. Government agencies, private businesses, and citizens are required to prevent discrimination against persons with disabilities. Discrimination in education, health, employment, and other social services. There is the 1992 Magna Carta for Disabled Persons, later amended to the 2007 Magna Carta for Persons with Disabilities. So now we cannot say disabled persons. We should say persons with disabilities. In 2007, the Philippines signed the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. These laws in support of PWDs are very important. But later, my experience as a PWD made me realize that having laws is not enough. Many of these laws
are not fully implemented. Despite the laws, Filipino PWDs still face a lot of discrimination. They are challenged with unequal access to facilities, services, and work. Though struggling through my disability, I passed the entrance examination to attend one of the public universities in Manila. I thought the conditions for PWDs in higher educational institutions would be much better compared to my school in Antipolo. But I was very disappointed. There were still no ramps for my wheelchair and no elevators either. So I had to be carried up the stairs to the classrooms or library on the upper floors. It was a very difficult and challenging phase of my life. Through sheer determination and with the loving care of my parents, teachers, and schoolmates, I finished my university education. I went for several job interviews after graduation. In many cases, I felt that I could have been hired if I was not physically disabled, if I wasn't in a wheelchair. I heard similar grievances from other persons with disabilities. Did you know that only 10% of employable persons with disabilities are able to find work? I understand that PWDs all over the world face similar problems. Even in an industrialized country like Canada, thousands of Canadians with disabilities are currently not working, even if they have the potential to work in an inclusive labor market. I was finally employed in a government office. Although I have to work while I'm in a wheelchair, I feel I am as effective and competent as other colleagues who do not have physical disabilities. I appreciate the 20% discounts available for PWDs in transportation, medicines, professional medical fees, restaurants, hotels, recreation and leisure venues, and funeral and burial expenses, as well as VAT exemptions. I am happy that COMELEC has policies to help PWDs register and vote in the coming elections. In the 2013 elections, only 80,000 out of 365,000 registered PWDs voters were able to cast their votes. I appeal to government and political leaders. Put more resources into facilities and services and that overcome obstacles faced by PWDs. I appeal to all Filipinos and Canadians who are not challenged by disabilities to show solidarity with all PWDs. Have compassion for many PWDs all over the world who continue to struggle for their rights. People with disabilities have so much to contribute to building a better world.
When I was growing up, I was very close with my grandma on my mother's side. My parents, my siblings, and I visited her often. That's how we came to know her best friend and neighbor, Grand Aunt Nancy. I very much enjoyed Grand Aunt Nancy's company. She was always cheerful and kind-hearted. She entertained us with delightful stories of her early life in a farming community in rural Alberta. She always inquired about our life in school and wondered about other concerns. Grand Aunt Nancy, who is now in her 80s, has been living in her own condo unit for some time now. Knowing she lives alone, I continue to be in touch with her to see how she's getting on. Last year, she agreed to welcome one of her nieces to stay with her to assist her with housekeeping chores and grocery shopping. The niece also volunteered to take Grand Aunt Nancy to visit the doctor, the bank, and her friends and other relatives. I was glad to see that she had company. On one of my visits, I noticed that Grand Aunt Nancy seemed to be no longer her cheerful self. On a subsequent visit, I also saw bruises in her arms and she was noticeably limping. Her niece
was also not around during my visits. It was only after my repeated queries about her well-being that Grand Aunt Nancy began to reveal her condition. In Grand Aunt Nancy's words, her niece has constantly been grumbling and yelling at her. She complains at Grand Aunt's forgetfulness and for having to take on too many housekeeping chores. One day, in a fit of anger, her niece grabbed her arm and pushed her, causing her to fall and injured her leg. I was in a great shock on hearing this abusive treatment by her niece. Grand Aunt Nancy told me she had to give her pension check to her niece for the purchase of groceries and medicines. Any unspent funds were supposed to be deposited in Grand Aunt's bank account, but this did not happen, as she found out when one of her checks bounced. I had heard on the news about abuses of elderly Canadians, but I did not fully realize the extent of this tragic problem until I came face to face with Grand Aunt Nancy's painful and heartbreaking experience. I discussed her situation with my mom, and we decided to refer her to an Edmonton local organization working to prevent the abuse of older persons. Thankfully, this NGO was able to investigate and take action, including the eviction of the niece from her home. Grand Aunt Nancy also agreed to move in a reputable retirement residence for seniors with adequate care and facilities. I continued to visit her, and I am so glad she regained much of her cheerful disposition.
Hello, I'm Emily. I work in an NGO dedicated to helping prevent the abuse of older people and the elderly. Our center receives calls from older people suffering from various abuses or from other people who are reporting such abuses. We assess the appropriate level of response, give advice, supports, counseling, and referrals. We also alert appropriate authorities on any legal or urgent action needed to protect the victims. Elder abuse, such as the case of Grand Aunt Nancy, is now increasingly recognized worldwide as a serious violation of human rights of older persons. The World Health Organization estimates 1 in 6 people 60 years and older experienced some form of abuse in community settings during the past year. In Canada, around 750,000 people, or 10% of the population, suffer from elder abuse. Isn't this alarming? What might we consider elder abuse? Again, the World Health Organization defines elder abuse as a single or repeated act or lack of appropriate action occurring within any relationship where there's an expectation of trust which causes harm or distress to an older person. But where can older people be abused? Well, elder abuse can happen anywhere, including a family member's house, an assisted living facility, or even in their own home. And by the way, elder abuse can be committed by healthcare workers, caregivers, and even family members and friends. In case you are wondering what constitutes as elder abuse, there are many forms of elder abuse: physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, financial abuse, neglect, violation of rights and freedoms, and systemic or institutional abuse. While we hear of elder abuse almost every day, it will not stop on its own. Someone needs to step in and help. Many older adults are too ashamed to report any form of abuse, or they are afraid to make a report, fearing that the abuser will get back and make the situation worse. So elder abuse is very much underreported. The problem of elder abuse in Alberta is reaching crisis level. The COVID-19 pandemic has disproportionately affected older persons facing isolation and more severe illness. The good news is that there are now numerous social service agencies and NGOs responding to the needs of older persons. The Alberta Elder Abuse Awareness Council, for example, is a group of Albertans dedicated to increasing awareness and supporting a community response to elder abuse. And oh yes, shelters are very important. There are 3 elder abuse shelters in Alberta. Although the federal and provincial governments have allocated funds to support such elder abuse prevention programs, many agencies and groups believe that more resources are essential. I am more familiar with the problem of elder abuse in Canada, but I've heard from Filipino friends and researchers that elder abuse also exists in the Philippines, as in many other global South countries. To address this problem, the Philippine House of Representatives passed in 2019 Bill 7030, or the Anti-Elder Abuse Act. This bill seeks to penalize with jail time and fines the accordance of the revised penal code abuses against senior citizens. Sadly, elder abuse is only one of the problems of older people. There is now a campaign to declare a proposed United Nations Convention on the Rights of Older Persons to protect the rights and welfare of the growing population of older persons in society, specifically addressing ageism and age discrimination across the globe. In daily life, what do ageism and age discrimination mean? They come in many forms, such as negative attitudes and stereotypes towards older people, discrimination in the healthcare system, lack of employment opportunities, receiving an unfair wage, preconceived negative notions about older people, imposing standards based on the statistics of younger population, failing to consider the needs of older people. Canada and some other higher income nations have been able to provide programs such as the Old Age Security, OAS program, and the Canadian Pension Plan, CPP, to support Canadians in their retirement. Global South countries have less resources or less prioritization to assess older persons after their retirement. In the Philippines, only some senior citizens receive social pensions, but all senior citizens are entitled to enjoy 20% discount on generic medications, vitamins, medical supplies and equipment, medical and dental services in private facilities, professional medical fees, public transportation, hotels, and restaurants. And there are express lanes for senior citizens in all government offices and commercial establishments. Many elderly Canadians do not enjoy such discounts except in a few small business establishments. There's a lot of work and challenges in overcoming elder abuse and protecting the rights of older persons. My appeal is for generations of citizens in all governments to provide institutions to seriously promote and implement a UN Convention on the Rights of Older Persons.
We now welcome the Vice President of LINGAP-Canada, Josie Pallard, to give the closing remarks for the celebration of Human Rights Day.
Honored guests, speakers, ladies and gentlemen, with great pleasure, I want to say thank you very much for this excellent way of celebrating Human Rights Day. From the bottom of my heart, I want to thank our co-sponsors, Congress of Philippine Associations of Alberta, Changing Together, a Center for Immigrant Women, Filipino-Canadians Association of Alberta, Migrant Alberta, University of the Philippines Alumni Association of Edmonton, and the Artist House Studio. To all the participating actors who presented the monologues with enthusiasm, passion, and commitment. To LINGAP-Canada writers of the Human Rights Monologue, no other than our dear Dr. Virginia Cawagas and Dr. To Suihin. To the contributors of specific monologues, Laura Cawagas, Shanil Ranasingh, and Migrante Alberta. To everyone around the world who attended this 2021 celebration of Human Rights Day. We have joined millions of people and many United Nations agencies, governments, NGOs, and civil society organizations in celebrating this very important United Nations International Day. We hope these LINGAP-Canada Human Rights Monologues have helped you to raise awareness and compassion for all peoples suffering from human rights violence in the Philippines, in Canada, and throughout the world. Let us, through the inspirational messages of Human Rights Day, to engage in personal and social action to protect and defend human rights, and hence contributing to the building of a peaceful, just, inclusive, and sustainable world. To everyone, thank you very much. Mabuhay, and maraming salamat po sa inyong lahat.
And to inspire us to promote and defend human rights, not just on Human Rights Day, but throughout the days of our lives, let us join in the spirit of the song One Love. The Marley family launched a reimagined version of the Bob Marley's iconic anthem, One Love to support UNICEF, work for children affected by COVID-19. The song was recorded by the Marley family in response to call by UNICEF to help reimagine a fairer, more just world for children whose lives have been upended by the COVID-19 pandemic, and to honor the late Bob Marley.
One love, one heart, let's get together and feel alright. One love, one heart, let's get together and feel alright. Hear the children crying. One love, hear the children crying. One heart, give thanks and praise to the Lord, and I will feel alright. Saying, let's get together and feel alright. Let them all pass all their dirty remarks. There is one question I really love to ask. Is there a place for the hopeless sinner who has hurt all mankind just to save his own? Believe me, one love, one heart. What about a get together and feel alright? As it was in the beginning, so shall it be in the end. Give thanks and praise to the Lord, and I will feel alright. Let's get together and feel alright. One more thing, let's get together to fight this holy Armageddon. One love. So when the man comes, there will be none of them. Have pity on those whose chances grow thinner. There ain't no hiding place from the Father of creation.
As it was in the beginning, so we shall be in the end. See, we all accustomed to sinning when we should be making amends. It's a war inside of my head, my weapon of choice is a pen. Leave my scars on a sheet of paper instead of me scarring a friend. Everyone is a friend, we ought to be thoughtful. See, together we hella resourceful. The religion is love and I'm an apostle. I swear by my rhyme book and it is chock full. Our prayers for everything to get better, for humans to get it together before we're remorseful. Cause that would be awful.
One love. What about a one love? One love. What about let's get together and feel alright? Hear the children crying. One love. Hear the children crying. One heart. Give thanks and praise to the Lord, and I will feel alright. Saying, let's get together and feel alright. Give thanks and praise to the Lord, and I will feel alright. Say, let's get together and feel alright. Give thanks and praise to the Lord, and I will feel alright. Give thanks and praise to the Lord, and I will feel alright.
Thank you all so much for joining us. And thank you again for all the actors.
Thank you so much too. We enjoy, and we are very happy for participate. Thank you.
Yes.
Pictures.
Yes, if you'd like to be a part of our picture, please turn on your video.
Oh,
Thank you
okay.
to Erica and Chris for all the technical energies and wisdom. Okay.
Just gonna give it a little bit longer. Wow, we're getting a lot of videos. Okay, I will take a picture in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. And Virginia Kawagas gives apologies for not being physically with us, but she's watching it from Greenlands. Okay.